distances. So humans began to interact with each other. And look at this. Who knew that one could be an archaeologist studying jewelry? Apparently you can be. And early on, there were beads being made out of shells and stones and bone, maybe to signify something about one's social status in a group. And look at how finely detailed some of them were. This one was just a little over an inch in its original size, and it's a lovely horse's head. And of course, this really fascinates me because the scientists don't know exactly what it means, but there were various carvings on these pieces that may not have been decorative, but might have been to record some kind of information to be saved. And of course, most people are familiar with the cave paintings and some of the early carvings that archaeologists have found. Let's see, let's come around this way. If the other side shows us something about social life and imagination, this side of the panel tells us something about the importance of group life, the importance of community, which you heard about with the old timer. On another panel, hunting required humans to begin to fashion tools together and have strategies for sharing food and hunting for food. This also meant that by 800,000 years ago, we start to have fires around the hearth so that people could cook their foods and share it together, forming a basis for a kind of community. Here we have much larger brains, so it requires, after giving birth, that more and more humans are involved in assisting the nurturing and development and social life of adolescents into adults. And these are all things we continue today. New kinds of networks and relationships, both physical and present, and even digitally, like our ways of connecting through the internet today. And look here, this is one of the panels that fascinates me. We're in a period of great climate fluctuations too. But just as we were a million years ago when the climate fluctuations were happening, we can discern that there were species of humans with larger brain sizes. And of course, my question about that is, did the larger brain size enable us to survive all these changes and fluctuations? Or were they a result of? They probably are companion pieces of phenomena that were going on. Here too, we see a comparison of the chimpanzee brain with a human brain. And because I'm interested in other species, what I find interesting is that there is a size difference. But I also know that if I dissected an elephant, I'd find elephants have larger brains. So what's the significance of the difference? You'll notice there are many more lines in the adult human brain than there are in the chimpanzee. And what this indicates is that we actually have folded brain matter within which we collect information and functionality, which makes a difference in what we can do. And this is not a part of the exhibit, but my research shows that there are differences, but that sometimes we can perform the same functions as chimpanzees and vice versa, because something about our brains lets us be flexible and adaptable. Let's see. As I watch how things are winding down with people looking at the exhibit, let me see whether there are other things you'd like to note about it. Heard about, here's something.
We should have had that.
This is also one of my favorite panels about adapting to different climates. Look at this taller, thinner Homo erectus, who had long legs and a narrow body as a way of adapting to a hot climate, because heat could be dissipated by a lean body better than a short body. So maybe you see a little of yourself in Homo erectus. I, on the other hand, see a lot of myself in the Neanderthal, someone with short legs and a broad body, well adapted to cold climates because the shape of the body, the size of the body can accommodate adaptation to cold and preserving heat. Corresponding to these differences, you'll see that Homo erectus was in fact living in warmer climates, Africa, East Africa, North Africa, Southern Asia, and the Middle East, and that the the Neanderthal species was migrating into Europe and northern parts of Asia. Let's see. Oh, come and see this. We already looked at something about how the social life of humans led to imagination that could produce art and jewelry and the use of color. But tools were adapted to environment and functionality early on. Some were for hunting and for the butchering of meat that was being caught. And we can know that the tools were used because the bones themselves tell us that they have been sort of damaged a bit by the chipping away of the flesh. But look at these finer products too, like the ability to make harpoon points. Early fishing was a part of our story, a part of the human ancestral story. But even a more refined tool like a needle shows that using the hides of animals and perhaps other products, early humans were able to fashion clothes and other products. And in fact, if you look back at the statue of the mother and the child, she has in her mouth a piece of probably animal hide, and she's using one of those tools to be able to create punctures in it, probably to attach something to it or to attach fabric to itself. And what I love about the statue representation is also that the child is chewing on a piece of hide. It reminds me of children today trying to imitate what their parents do as a way of learning in their very acts of play.
It's gonna be here till May. So. I can too. Okay.
Here we have a panel that shows us some of the benefits and cost of evolution for us humans who stand upright. One of the favorites in the exhibit is this panel, and I see people spend a lot of time here. Walking upright changed a lot about our bodies. We, in a good way, we could move from one climate to another, from one landscape to another. We could hunt, we could adapt, we could escape predators. But there is a cost to walking upright, and that includes slip disc, lower back pain, arthritis in hips and knees, and even fallen arches. So when you are enjoying the benefits of being a human who walks upright, also note that you might have some of the costs. And there are other benefits and costs related to meat eating. Meat eating was fairly safe, but it was dangerous to hunt and meat spoils quickly. Big brains helped us to collect information and to survive and solve problems. But the other cost was that giving birth is a much more painful and difficult process. And we have less well-developed infants requiring more attention. We are also very proud of our spoken language as humans and what it enables about community and interaction in social life. But it also means that we're one of the species who can't swallow and breathe at the same time. So we have to hold our breath a little bit to prevent certain kinds of choking. We have been able to produce food and do agriculture, respond to catastrophes and the like, but that very process of feeding ourselves also becomes a situation that creates concentration of humans, grounds for contagious diseases, and a lot of waste that can pollute the environment. I think we can adjourn to the classroom now, so we'll all be together.
Well, let's go ahead and get started and have some conversation. One of the things Rick has already mentioned it, and we I don't know how many times we emphasized this during the time when we're at one particular location. And that is a sub-theme of the theme of the exhibit, not so the title of it, is a question: what does it mean to be human? And you'll note it. Remember, you'll have seen that on the sort of the entry panel for the exhibit is a place where the people who visit can actually fill out sticky notes and paste it on there. What I'd like to start with is, if you all already have a post-it note on there, if you'd like to tell us what it said, or if you haven't put one on there yet, you'd like to answer that question now and then think about posting it later on, that would be great too. But how would you answer the question, what does it mean to be human?
Well, in my first paper for class, I said that to be human means to observe the world around us, to pose questions, and then to formulate answers to those questions.
Great scientific answer. Who else?
I put, and I just put one up there just now, actually, after. I put that to be human is to be fragile, because we're the only ones left in our.
So the last five head standing is
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Yes.
Well, feeling a little not so optimistic these days, and having taken a class here in seminary about the problem of evil, it makes me think that, I don't know, but are we the only species that has the capacity, the desire and the capacity, and maybe derives some kind of satisfaction from inflicting pain and suffering on others?
Yeah.
So I think we can do a lot of really good things, but we have the ability and capacity to do really bad things in big, big numbers. So
I suspect that ethologists would be able, that people who study the behavior of animals would be able to tell us that there are examples, perhaps not large numbers examples, but there are examples of members of other species who seem to gratuitously engage in harmful behavior to other animals, other species, and so forth. One of the examples of this was the two lions in East Africa, I guess it was. Savo, where the lions of Savo, anyhow, they actually had their carcasses at the Field Museum in Chicago, or at least they did. But these seem to get simple pleasure at attacking not only other animals, but human beings. And there was a film made about that, The Ghost in the Shadow, I think.
The darkness, the ghost in the darkness.
The Ghost in the Darkness, thank you. My shadow wasn't dark enough, so. Yeah.
We're getting some online comments
Oh, yes.
in response. Erica says, Tricia basically gave her answer, but Erica cites Descartes, I think therefore I am. And Imani writes, animals have a lot of human traits we think only humans have. She also writes, humans have a personal relationship with God and are in need of salvation. Humans have great potential for evil as well as compassion. Humans are to be stewards of the earth, but also have the capacity to destroy it.
All good answers.
And you can see the chat right there.
Oh,
as
sure.
it-
Oh,
as it
great.
pops up as well.
Tells me if you tell me then I'm gonna watch that.
Yeah, I'll watch
the
with
folks
you.
here. Okay, great, thanks. One of the things that Rick did talk about was that there is in the larger society a kind of prevailing notion that well, not a prevailing notion necessarily, but a very vocal notion that you will hear from time to time, that science generally, and particularly the science that's exhibited in the exhibit, is inherently in conflict with traditional religious perspectives on what it is to be human, what it means to be human. And in some ways, at least in the American context, this is rooted in two very, very influential, but historically deeply inaccurate works that were produced in the late 19th century. But nevertheless, this is very pervasive view that you'll find from a lot of, at least, voices that are speaking loudly. In terms of your experience in dealing with folks, what have you found people's view in terms of sort of the relationship between the science, like the science shown in the exhibit, and their own investment in and participation in religious community?
Well, I'll share from my experience as a chaplain, often they don't expect me to know anything about science. And my favorite is, somebody that says, "Oh, I'm an atheist." And I go, "Oh, great, let's talk." And they go to scientific and I can talk right with them, being a former biology teacher. And yeah, I believe that too. Yet I'm a person of faith also.
Sure.
So that's just one living example that I have right now.
Don't know, somebody online.
People from my class ought to be able to
Yeah,
jump right
can
in.
you ask the question again? I couldn't
Yeah,
hear
no,
that.
basically the question I'm asking is that given that there is this the historically and social perspective on science religion being inherently in conflict, it may not be the majority view of the population, but it is a very loud one that you will hear in various places. What has been your experience in terms of folks that you've dealt with and had relationships with around this topic? Or maybe it's not a topic that anybody ever actually talks about because it seems to be so contentious. What?
Well, mine is mixed, and I teach a Disciple 1. It's the first in a series Bible study, so it covers about 75% of the Bible. And I would say, people who still read the Bible literally have more trouble with science and with evolution. But I came out of quantitative and very analytical background, so a lot of people I know, and engage with, don't think science and religion are in conflict. And that's been my, view for a long time.
Yes.
Comment.
Oh, come.
Chat that just
Chat.
popped up.
Erica writes, I have found that people within the church or on the edge of the church really appreciate it when science talks are brought into the church discussions. It answers the questions we're afraid to ask. I'm bringing both of my churches to see the exhibit for that reason.
Hoorah.
Yay.
That's great. Yeah, it's, I think that the more people actually have an opportunity to experience the science, and then actually if they have opportunities to talk with either scientists or religious folks who think about the science, they quickly discover that there are more than one way to think about that relationship. And that's part of what we'll do the workshop this afternoon, is to talk about the variety of relationships that people can have with regard to the relationship of science and religion. Yeah, Rick.
Yeah, I was interested in your point about as chaplain talking with the student. Often, I think that in society, that we think that the conflict is initiated on the side of religion, but it could equally be that the conflict is an assumption that scientists or people who think that they're both scientists and they ascribe to a, by definition, non-scientific view of philosophical atheism. And so I think that it can cut both ways. I think that one of the ways in which you presented the question, Jim, as one way which I would do too, and which many people have, which is that, okay, yeah, a certain literal belief in a reading of the Bible and beliefs formed in that way, that's kind of where the conflict arises. But it can equally, it seems to me, arise from scientists thinking that. And knowing then that, oh, that, or assuming that that's got to be the problem. That's why in my introductory comments, I mentioned that there are two devastating assumptions that, that people of religious faith don't, or they reject the science, or that scientists can't embrace religious commitments and insights.
But I heard you ask the question that it reminded me when I was doing campus ministry at Michigan Tech. I set up a table in the student union and put up a little sign that said all questions about religion answered 25 cents.
Yeah.
And I would, not frequently, but every now and then I'd have usually an engineering student or physics students or math students stop by and say, not that they would be the only ones, but anyhow, that they would stop by and say, well, I'm an atheist, I don't think it. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. Which God don't you believe in?
Yeah.
And then I would remind them that, or let them know that there's actually a book that describes 10 different forms of theism. And I would suggest that unless they rule them all out, then they probably shouldn't call themselves an atheist, or it might be a Buddhist, which would still make them religious.
There are a couple of more comments. Can you read those, Lori?
Yeah, I can. Start with Rachel's is new. Okay, Rachel says, growing up, it was contentious, but after getting my undergraduate in a scientific field, there's been almost no discussion about it. It's not contentious to my friend group or ministry. This might have something to do with me regularly referencing and interacting with science in my ministry just because of my background. And then Erica also says, I have many friends who got a degree in ministry and then went to get a master's in a sciencey field. I think you people who can master both are a gift to the generations that want to question and wrestle with how these two subjects meet.
Yeah, we've been talking about the conflict model that gets a lot of press. But I suggest that, and I've heard other folks say that there's just not a lot of conversation about this subject matter, although when there is that opportunity, that people seem to be glad that there is that opportunity. I'd suggest that it may well be that the prevailing view is that science is a really good thing and religion is a really good thing, just to have anything to do with each other. What I've called in the past the Robert Frost theory of the science and religion relationship: strong walls make good neighbors. And maybe that's why that discussion doesn't take place. And so for some, the fact that it's not taking place in any kind of constructive way that we try to exemplify in the traveling exhibit leads folks to think that this kind of more publicized conflict model is more broad and widespread than it actually is.
Our senior pastor does talk about science and religion and doesn't believe they're in conflict. And so in sermon series, depending upon what the topic is, it comes up.
Sure.
So, and recently did one specific on this. And so I would say when I've been here, most of the people from Resurrection stay and go through the exhibit and really like it. There've been a couple that left pretty quickly, but I would say most of them are really interested.
Well, after I took Dr. Howell's class and became a pastor myself, one of my favorite sermon series I did was like eight sermons on, science, faith, and religion based on the class, using some of the books that we had used. And well, of course, I loved that sermon series. And I had to tell myself, stop researching, get to writing. But I think I found that the church congregation thought it was valuable too. I think it was a time, you know, with, the cloning was going on. And so that was, you know, very timely. And so personally, I find it very, helpful to speak about both.
And if I may, I think when Kathy and I were in that science, theology, and ministry course a long time ago, I asked the question of students, could you go out and talk to people and find out what concerns them about science? And it was during the height of the public school kinds of school board elections in Kansas, and the debate about evolution was heated. Oh my. And my students came back, nobody's talking about evolution. They wanted to know, can a Christian farmer plant genetically modified crops? They were interested in how science could help them work out the ethics involved in their faith. So we shouldn't always presume that a conflict or any discussion, as you were kind of saying there.
In fact, where there are sort of ongoing discussions about science and religion, it tends to be more in the area of ethics and technology than it is in science and theology. When you start getting with theology, you start getting personal. So, but ethics is just how best to do things. So, I shouldn't say it's just that, but it is that much more practical in terms of people's life and experience. I want to other people get interested. What was it? Was there anything in? Oh,
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Can you discuss the missing link?
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
go for it, Jim. I'm happy to
don't ask
take
a
that.
semi-theologian a question about science. But
The missing link is the gap between science and religion. No, seriously. Yeah, the missing link is a concept that's been around again, one that's a concept that's been inherited for many decades. And it's the idea that was especially based on the scala naturae of the idea of a linear progression of complex life with human beings, the end of it all, the on top. And the idea that there would be a gap between humans and other forms of life was the missing link. That was the origination of that concept, as I understand it. Then in science, it also gets talked about any fossil that's old is because it wasn't known before is a missing link. But then the concept of the missing link has been used in the conflict model by those who would prefer evolution to go away, the concept of it as a natural process, to basically say, oh, you see, there is a missing link, the scientists will never find it. Well, every time there's a claim that the missing link has been found, it creates two other missing links on either side of it, which gets kind of ridiculous, but it's all in this linear kind of mode of thinking, which, as I mentioned, has been disbanded by science, abandoned by science for many decades. And so the concept is no longer valuable in a scientific context.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that the idea also came from the idea of this great chain of beings.
That's
So
the
that there
scala
are
naturae.
exactly the links in the chain.
Right.
And that sometimes there's a perception that if we find a missing link, it will be sort of an intermediate fossil between, in this kind of linear, assuming that things are evolving in a certain direction. And we see a lot of fossils that kind of are, or species that are intermediate between, one form of organism and another one. So from that sense, like Rick said, we don't think about missing links in science, but from that sense, in many ways, we have found lots of missing links in the form of fossils that share different combinations of characteristics or species.
one of the
I hope that answers the question.
Well, one of the matters is in terms of evolutionary history, it's parents and children all the way back. I mean, that's, so there's continuity in terms of simply biological reproduction going forward. That's one thing. It's also the case that Mother Nature is not a good record keeper. So the fossil record is simply not fully available, which is one of the reasons why in the exhibit where it shows the various species, it doesn't join them together in an actual tree, is because it's still uncertain who all the other participants in this story are. And so those sort of familial relationships are not at all clear. Besides which, it might not be easy to determine how similar they are, in spite of the fact that if you take two human beings on opposite sides of the earth and compare their genome, it's virtually identical, except in very small places. If you take two neighboring lowland gorillas and look at their genomes, they're much more diverse.
There's another
than
question.
humans.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, finish.
No, all I was trying to say is that it is this notion that the notion of the missing link is an imaginary idea that grows out of cultural considerations, not scientific.
There's another question. It says, is there a problem with the Cambrian explosion? In other words, consistency with evolutionary theory.
Well, first of all, the explosion took about 60 million years to take place, so that's a slow explosion under circumstance. But I won't speak to that. I'm not a biologist, but I think Rick or Brianna can.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is pretty clear is that evolution doesn't proceed just one equal step at a time, all through time, but rather there are time periods where there are, in a sense, releasers of innovation in how the genetics evolve, how it changes, and how it's then represented by things that fossilize. So, for example, the genes that allowed shells or skeletons to be developed in an organism meant that there was suddenly an explosion of preservation. And so it looks like an explosion, but it's really, as Jim, you very well pointed out, a lengthy period of time over which this new innovation of hard parts allows preservation of many, many different forms. If you go further back in time and you look really carefully, there are tons and tons and tons of animals that have soft body parts, and they will leave trackways, or they will leave impressions of their morphology, their outward appearance in the fossil record. And we know that the Cambrian explosion is preceded by a great diversity of life, even before the explosion of preserved life.
Yeah, the other, forget it.
There's more.
It's not a
Please.
good science question.
Yeah.
Please.
My students ask why evolution stopped. Has it? Do humans no longer need to adapt to a changing environment?
Oh, I think you should take that.
But we very much do need to. Anytime there is genetic diversity, there is the raw material for adjusting to changes in the environment. And of course, the environment keeps changing through natural means. And humans have also then exerted a tremendous rate of our own changes that add to the ways in which the environment is changing. And so the idea of adaptation is not lost. All that one would have to see is that in addition to changes in our genetic components, that we have evolved the capacity to learn in complex ways and to pass that on socially, what's cultural learning. And so there is this combination of both cultural adaptation that occurs along with biological adaptation. One example is with regard to biological adaptation that has been rampant over the last number of years and last number of thousands of years are our immune systems. Our immune systems adapting to new disease vectors and how quickly the immune system genetically has changed. And also the immune system itself has this inherent capacity to adjust to new microbes. Natural selection goes on. We know of people who die from infectious diseases, for example. And there are others who do not. And that by definition is the continuation of evolution.
Yeah, no, I was gonna mention, because there was a question, what discernible ways I think our like immune system is, and sort of the environment is a big way. Also, one of my favorite examples has to do with diet, because that's what I study, but the ability to digest lactose in milk. So about 5,000 years ago, there's no evidence that any humans could digest lactose as adults. So almost everybody can digest it as babies for nursing. But within the last 5,000 to 7,000 years, there has been very strong selection on genes or genetic variants in multiple genetic variants in different populations living with domestic animals like cows and sheep and goats that we get milk from. Which are a great source of clean, liquid, protein and fat that multiple populations have basically evolved to be able to digest milk. So about a third of people on Earth can digest milk today. So that's an example. And so that's in the last several thousand years, which is actually really quick from an evolutionary perspective. There's also things like adaptation to living in extreme environments, like high altitude environments. There's good evidence for adaptation for populations that live at high altitude. So yeah, there's a whole variety of different examples.
Successful adaptation also depends upon the rate of the change of the environment and the rate of change in terms of the genetic alternatives there are in order to be adaptive to the environmental change. One of the challenges we face at the present time, in spite of the fact that we have this additional layer of technological capability that is a resource for adaptation, is that the actions we are taking now are changing the environment so quickly. The question of whether or not we're able, either biologically or even technologically, able to adapt to it fast enough may raise the question of whether or not Homo sapiens themselves face an extinction, apart from other creatures that are also going to be faced with extinction by virtue of this rapid change in the environment. A change that's more rapid than at least recorded history shows has a change in terms of the environment. The other thing I was going to mention in terms of the I'm sorry.
There was an article, and I can't remember where I read it, and I only skimmed it because it's not my department, but that perhaps the human female reproductive system and birthing system was evolving because we have apparently a higher rate of failures than other mammals as compared to other mammals. And I
don't know the article that you're referring to, but it has some basis. What you're saying is that what's called the dilemma of obstetrics, of giving birth, it's dangerous, it's hard, so it's so interesting to kind of contemplate the way in which cultural matters of being able to assist birth, that in ways that were not possible, many thousands of years ago, that changes the equation of what's possible. So yeah, I don't know this specific article.
A new thing in the chat says that the missing links seem to be in one of the exhibits panels. That's why there was that question. And then a new comment that came up right after that. Also, this is not the female reproductive system. It's the only one the humans have, as far as I know.
I love it.
fair enough.
I don't know. I don't think we put the phrase missing link in the exhibit. That's interesting.
No.
We
I
have,
don't think we would have put that,
Okay.
used that
Probably,
phrase,
it was
so.
probably a response to some visual that is there.
Oh, yeah, it
And
could
it may well be that one where it shows the different species, but they don't connect together.
be, yeah,
So
maybe there's
maybe just
an
that visual.
inference, yeah. I was just looking to see if I could.
The other
find
thing that
the
I want to suggest with regard to the notion of the Cambrian explosion is, and this is something that's related today as well. There's a lot of talk today about tipping points and cascading events. That is where there are systems that, in which there's a lot of input in it, but no real significant change. And then there's a point that's reached in which it changes all at once. You can see this in terms of just the tipping point, tipping something over. As soon as the center of gravity gets far enough over, the mass follows it all the way down to the ground. And that's true for a lot of things. It's even true of ideas. There's a quote that I like from, I think it's from a Jesuit paleontologist, who said, there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Which is to say, and you can see this historically, there are ideas that existed much earlier before they became sort of validated within human culture and that sort of thing. But it's this idea of both tipping points and cascades where it certainly starts, and there's a whole variety of consequences that occur. But they sort of happen all at once. Yes.
With all the vaccines we have, giving us immunity or sort of an artificial immunity to things, and pills that will cure this, and surgeries that will fix this, how does that affect our us evolving? I mean, us not evolving, but
Yeah, yeah.
adapting. How am I going to create, my own immunity if I have artificial immunities all the time?
Well, there's a certain degree in which human technology provides another level of shield against external change. So vaccine development is actually protecting us against pathogens from the outside who are simply doing their normal thing, that is seeking a prey that's very convenient.
Yeah.
But what the vaccine doesn't make us more immune, but what it does do is it fights off the thing that is there. If you take the vaccine away, we're still vulnerable to whatever that
But
pathogen
would we
was.
eventually, without a vaccine, would we adapt on our own?
Well, I guess that's the idea of herd immunity is that sort of idea.
And I think what Jim's saying is an important thing to remember. So we don't evolve as individuals, so species or populations evolve. And also that we don't, I like to give the example, like if you're a weightlifter, if you stop lifting weights, your muscles will go back to their original size. So it's very similar, like we don't have the genes for that new immunity that we would then pass down. As far as sort of a, species-wide thing, I think I guess the way that I think about it is that if modern medicine, let's call it sort of writ large, is allowing people to live and reproduce who wouldn't otherwise, it might just mean that we have even more genetic diversity in our population kind of moving forward. So I don't know that that's a bad thing.
But it might also
Yeah.
be a cause for increased vulnerability without the technological shield that is there as well.
But those are the two sides of the same coin. There's a pretty deep question here, and I think that
Yes.
both answers are part of that same coin. Is that by virtue of being released from the things that would have been killing us,
Yeah.
that there's more genetic diversity, as Brianna pointed out, more genetic variation. There's a very big concept that has been discussed in evolutionary biology for the last 2 decades or more, called evolvability. And that's really what your question is about, that evolvability. What would happen to that?
Yeah.
And so the ability to evolve further, well, with greater genetic variability, that you would have greater evolvability. Okay, but Jim has the other side of the coin, the vulnerability side of it.
Yeah.
once you then take away that technology, that extra shield. And so it cuts both ways. Well, it's a pretty deep question you're asking.
Another basic part of it in terms of this evolutionary theory, and that is genetic variation is random. It's not in order to
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
resolve some adaptive challenge or some environmental
Yeah, that's
challenge.
important.
It just happens that a
Mhm.
certain variation does, as a matter of fact, provide greater adaptability to whatever the environmental circumstances might be.
I think what Rachel said in the chat follows up very well. There's reasons that the other Homo species all died out. Technology like vaccines is what keeps that from happening to us. While we catch up to the very quick evolution that simple organisms like viruses happen.
I do think it's interesting that at least some people are involved in the larger conversation about how humans make certain decisions, have certain practices that affect the biosphere, right? We rarely ask the question, what are we doing to affect our own adaptability and evolution? And are we conscious about the fact that that's happening?
Yeah.
You know, even cultural decisions can do that.
Oh, sure.
Access to the vaccine, because I have the financial means and the insurance, means that certain kinds of parts of the population will survive better than others.
Well, and one, just to maybe come back to sort of the reason for this whole conversation anyhow. We've been talking largely about the science of evolution and human evolution and that sort of thing. What has anything of this to do with the practice of ministry? Some of you who are actively engaged in that, and some of you who are preparing in order to do that. These are fun conversations, but I mean, what bearing does any of this science, or any science broadly speaking, have to do with the actual practice of ministry?
I think working as a hospital chaplain, it was essential to be able to lean in both sides. You know, I mean, I think there's sometimes a resistance on the part of other members of the interdisciplinary team. Not all of them, but occasionally there'd be some, not pushback, but not full understanding of what we bring to the care and the conversation. But then when you get in the patient's room, someone who's faced with something really big that might have some resistance to it, not resistance, but maybe their faith just doesn't quite gel with it. You know, how can a person who's there as a chaplain or, you know, maybe they're counseling with their minister in the church, how do you help them reconcile that, you know, some people just jump quickly, well, you know, this is the path God laid out for me, and if that's the path it is, then that's what I'm going to take, without really delving into what does that mean to them and how does that affect their faith. So helping people kind of bridge that gap when they're met with something so unexpected and sometimes so devastating. Of course, there's a lot of ethical questions that go into those conversations too, but sometimes people will be resistant to something because it doesn't fit into their faith system.
Science, the real life interaction between science and religion can raise challenging theological questions that, for instance, that whole domain is referred to as theodicy. That is, why do bad things happen to good people?
Right, exactly.
How is it that science and religion contribute to wrestling with that question?
Exactly. And just sitting at the bedside and listening to both the pain and the hope. And, you know, someone in the family might have a different opinion. They can be some pretty spirited conversations.
Yes.
Sure.
So,
And pastoral care itself.
Yeah.
Requires a pretty decent understanding of how our brains function. And I see that a lot in our current pastoral care courses that comes up. But the other place, a new place it's showing up is in worship and liturgy. And the current course last semester on worship actually had a unit on neuroscience and how understanding neuroscience teaches us something about how to make worship a more effective experience. And a piece of that I've read about has to do with engaging all the senses. which makes a difference in how you experience and retain what has happened in the worship experience.
The Dalai Lama would agree with that.
Yes.
Other questions from the field?
With regard to the last comment, though, that with regard to the chaplain experience, reminds me of a time number of years ago, maybe 12 years ago, when I was invited to a evangelical megachurch in Columbia, Maryland, called Bridgeway Community Church. Huge church for the East Coast. And I was invited to do their radio program, call-in program, called Tough Topic Tuesday. And evolution was the tough topic, and I said, sure. And it was good. It was, the call-in show was really very good. And I was told right before we went on that, let me give you, Dr. Potts, the breakdown of the people who listen to our radio program all up and down the East Coast, and it was about 85% short earth, short time creationists. And I said, okay. And it was interesting. We had some good conversation. In the case, at the end of that call-in show, I went into the fellowship hall down below in the basement of the church, and there were 200 people waiting for questions and discussion. And it was really quite good too. It was a good experience. But I remember one elderly person, a lady, who said that how can you bring science into our church? And her experience that she expressed to me was that she had 5 or 6, 7 years ago, something like that, was diagnosed with cancer. And she had cancer and was given 6 months to live. And she, would keep going back to the doctors. The doctors didn't know what to do, but she prayed, she prayed, she prayed, she prayed. And God saved me, and I'm here and I'm healthy. There's no longer any cancer in my body. And so how can you bring science into our church? And that made me pause, boom, boom, for a split second. And I said, do you still go to your doctor? And she said, well, yes, I need the medication from him. And I said, so you haven't given up on medical science? Well, I don't give up on my doctor. And so, in the room, there were these sort of like, but also, through gentle conversation, she said, okay, yeah, I see that there is a place for God and for what the doctors can do. And was that a win? I mean, just to get to that, out of that starting point. But that relates to the matter of, ministry and how you move the needle on a shared understanding of the world, both theologically, prayerfully, and through how we can discover things in the world.
That's fascinating. I had last fall, somebody started out in the disciple class. And when I mentioned that I would be refraining from calling God a he, we did, it was in the introductory session. When the introductions came around to her, it was after that, she said, I don't understand how God can't be a he, otherwise how would Mary get pregnant? So she's looking at science in Mary getting pregnant.
Yeah, conflation.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. But she probably didn't realize that.
Not intending to be facetious about that, but taking it a step further, you would wonder whose genome, whose chromosome was, carried the Y chromosome. Whose set of chromosomes carried the Y chromosome? Which may, because if it was parthenogenesis, it would have been a female child, not a male child.
What? Say that again. Wasn't it? And this is a crucial part of doing ministry, though. The big question is, how do you create civil conversation where there promises to be debate, conflict, right? And so what would those of you from the Smithsonian team advise? You probably have many instances like Rick's, where you have the potential for things to flare and get worse, but what do you do?
So I would say, I guess so I do volunteer training at the Natural History Museum, not only with volunteers in the human evolution exhibit, but with volunteers for all exhibits. And I do a training session on sort of how do you handle difficult topics or challenging conversations. And one of the things I talk about is to sort of ask more questions to figure out where the point of difficulty, where the pain point, where the discomfort is, and just to do a lot of listening, because most of the time you will figure out how to build a bridge, but some of it is really, listening with respect and figuring out where the difficulty is and how you might go about kind of making that attempt to build a bridge.
Yeah, sometimes
That's
my
one way I would
question,
answer that.
my question is, what's at stake for you?
Oh,
Or in my head, I'm thinking,
yeah.
what is this person afraid of losing?
Exactly.
If this
Yeah,
is
That's
true,
right. That's
right?
right. Yeah.
And I was at an event, a pastor had written a book, including a chapter on evolution and Adam and Eve in it. And we had a big public conversation of the book. And a woman came up afterward to the microphone in tears and said, "What am I supposed to tell my 5-year-old now?" It was clear she felt she was losing something, that something about the credibility of the Bible or her faith was really at stake. And what disappointed me is the pastor didn't address that, but simply doubled down on the science itself and its relationship to the faith.
But like you said, understanding what's underlying that and what the fear is really important.
Yeah, and
What's at stake? Yeah.
I really want to concur in what Brianna was saying. And it's also important as you explore that you don't do it in a way that is, I don't mean challenging, difficult, but challenging in to say there's something wrong with your question.
Exactly.
That is, it's a respect for it. It has to include an element of respect for the authenticity of the concern that the person has, even if it's grounded in something that's mistaken. And
Or just a different way than you think about it.
Right.
Yeah.
there's this is slightly different subject matter. There's a wonderful book on the current environmental circumstances. Some of you may know about it. It's by Catherine Hayhoe called Saving Us. And part of it is how do you have these kinds of conversations?
Oh, yeah.
And part of it is the sort of respectful encounter with the other person, whoever it may be. It's finding points of common value and common interest even, because it may well be along that line you discover something like this, where they've actually themselves already exhibited the very thing that they themselves, it's not as though we were extraordinarily coherent beings. We often believe one thing on one day and something else on the next, and the two things are completely different. I mean, even in conflict. So it really is possible, it seems to me, that these kinds of conversations, which is part of what underlies the whole of the exhibit, this quality of conversation, is something that we want to both champion as a real possibility with regard to this subject matter, but also generally speaking, particularly in times like these in which divisiveness and a lack of mutual respect is showing its ugly head.
Yeah, it's exactly the reason after that, the story I just told in Bridgeway Community Church, that what made the difference there is that the conversation was, in a sense, on their own territory.
Yeah.
That and we at the Smithsonian, we want to just show up and be there and to listen and not to preach that you've got to accept this, but rather have it as a start for a conversation. And we embrace difficult conversations. And so embracing difficult conversations, making a commitment to that, I think is really critical in this world today. And I would think it would be a very important thing as one is going into ministry.
And as a non-scientist myself, only one who pretends to be one now, having both Rick and Brianna be a part of this traveling exhibit is extraordinarily important because they exhibit the very qualities we're talking about. But I think it's also the case that when pastors become more acquainted with, not experts in, but acquainted with the variety of sciences that may bear on the life of their congregation, they're in a position of credibility to be able to engage their congregation around these subject matters, and members of their congregations who are also scientists, particularly if they can be in conversation with their pastors about these matters, are also better equipped to be able to talk to those in their congregations who are not scientists about these matters as well.
She's trying to get you back on.
I know, I'm trying to center you in your best shot. When I first started teaching science, theology, and ministry at St. Paul, one of the doctor of ministry students, not in my class, came up to me and said, "This is brilliant. Have you pursued this as important to evangelism?" And her point was, we literally ask a lot of people to stay out of the church because they happen to be scientists. We kind of communicate, there's no room for you here. And she was saying, we don't need to do that if we are people who engage science in our theology and our religious practice.
You know, two of you mentioned having difficult or embracing difficult conversations. We had a speaker here 3 or 4 years ago, Ibu Patel. I don't remember what year, but my small group actually read one of his books, and then I discovered through his organization there is a whole video series and teaching, and they take this to college campuses on how to have difficult conversations. So I took my small group through this process, and hoped that that would equip us better to have some of these conversations. But
Nice.
your approach matched.
Oh, awesome.
And
Oh,
I just
that's cool.
recognized that.
Oh, nice.
In other words, you ask questions, how did you come to that understanding? I want to understand. I want, can you?
I often suggest the volunteers just say, tell me more.
Yeah,
And it's
that's
a
it.
very
And that's
open-ended.
Chaplains do all the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, I was gonna relate that,
Exactly.
I'm a nurse, and I was gonna relate that back to that, tell me, and I work in cancer, and tell me, if I build a relationship with that person by getting their insights and their thoughts, then I think I naturally have, I don't wanna say a right, but I have more of an inroad to say, okay, well, have you looked at this perspective, or let's talk about maybe this, or, other perspectives, but without that, how do you feel first? I can't just go in and go, we gotta do this. Yeah.
We're 4:45. I don't want to prematurely bring this to an end, but
Let me ask whether there's anyone online who would like to raise a question or make a comment. And remember that if you have your cameras turned off, I can't tell. Seeing nothing, I will assume you could adjourn. I will mention this though, isn't it interesting how, how upbeat the exhibit is about community, compassion, and the roots of imagination? But on the flip side, how much is controversial in it? In my class, we've talked about evolution itself is controversial, issues of race that by implication are dealt with there, climate change as the popular vernacular goes, and also migration. But it's such a profound part of, all of those are profound parts of our human story. And we have difficulty.
I do have a question. So humans, Homo sapiens, share 99.9% DNA. What is that other 0.1%? Because I could imagine somebody might interpret a picture a certain way on the display, but I get a question like that, I'm just curious. What is the point?
Well, the 0.1% has often been assumed, or any difference genetically, has often been assumed to be geographically based, that there are geographic differences. And that's partly part of the matter of, it must be that's the case because there are races. And race is a social concept, not a biological one.
Right.
Instead, when you look at what varies across human populations, that those variations tend to be forming gradations across the globe, rather than this pocket is different from that pocket is different from that pocket. And so you have these gradients, what are called clines in biological genetic terms, CLINES, but gradients. And so that's just part of the variations that occur because populations have been moving all around. We tend to think, there was a dispersal and then everyone just sort of then got to their places and hunkered down, and that the differences have got to be pockets of geographic difference. That's not the case. Humans move. And as a result of that, there has been distances, but not always in the same direction on every characteristic that varies.
Some of that difference may be also that some of us have more Neanderthal or Denisovan.
No, not that part of it.
Not that part of it.
No, but the 1% or the 0.1% is how different we are from each other. So
Right,
like Jim and I might have a different, different genes in our immune system, different genes for height, different genes for our hair color, we both might have a gene that, we both wear glasses, so things that are similar, but so it's any sort of the differences that you might see really easily is actually just a tiny proportion of all of our genetic code. If that helps.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to thank you all and the folks who I've had my back to all during this time,
Your face.
except by virtue of facing you in the video. But I want to appreciate your participation in this. Those of you who are active pastors, I hope this is something that's been constructive for your own thinking about how you practice ministry. Those of you who are in the process of preparing for active pastoral or other forms of ministry, that this will contribute to your own education and preparation for that activity.
And Jim, is there something you would like to send to these people?
Oh, yes. If actually I have something I think I have here. If you will give me your email address, what I would like to be able to do is to send you two things. One is a book that I have written that's called the subtitle is A Parent's Guide on Science, Evolution, Human Origins, and the Christian Faith. Plus some additional resources that would be related generally to that subject matter, like bibliography and other kinds of video and other kinds of resources that people might be able to use. I was planning to do that for the Christian education folks, but I'll be glad to send that to anybody who is here. Just give me your email address.
Paper around?
And if you're online and would like to receive that material, please put your email contact in the chat. I'll save the chat and be sure that Jen has access to that information. So you want that?
So we're gonna, I guess, the paper will be sent around to just write your email address down.
Yes, if you're present, you'll have to write it down.
Just the email.
Yep.
Just
name
your
and
email.
Name,
Yeah.
maybe.
I put your name too.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, I started the list.
Sorry.
Oh, great, and I can see two in the chat, that's great.
Okay.
In the chat.
Yeah, we're getting some in the chat as well.
Yeah.
And is that everything?
Everything except my thanks to all of you who
Yeah.
participated in this. In this
We're
event.
getting
Thank you very
thanks
much.
and email, addresses. But I have a couple of things. If you're interested, we encourage you to complete this survey requested by the American Library Association. And if you act now and are in the room, you should get a free St. Paul pen to fill it out. And you can just give the survey to me. Also take one of the bookmarks because it has the other events that will occur available to you by the QR code, and it will take you to registration for those events. I know you've been made even more interested in those because of this late afternoon session. And let's see, is there anything else I should be doing? Oh, yeah, go back to the exhibit, and if you haven't already, put